Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this episode of Defense News Weekly, an in-depth investigation into the deadly 2017 ambush in Niger. We talk to the journalist behind a new project that raises major concerns about the attack. And a slew of new contracting moves takes place at the Dubai Air Show. Find out which country is the first to buy the Wolverine light attack aircraft. And a potential Russian unmanned fighter competes against the F-35. Daniel Woolfolk will have all that and more. Plus, we go inside a new armor and cavalry museum at Fort Benning, Georgia, with reporter Todd South. Finally, our team of editors provides analysis on some of the biggest military stories of the week. It's coming at you full speed this week, the latest from the Pentagon to the platoon. Stay with us for Defense News Weekly. Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Andrea Scott. Up first this week, when 4 soldiers died in a 2017 attack in Niger, the military issued a report that placed blame on some of the lower-ranking troops involved. But a new investigation raises questions about the Pentagon's explanation of the events. The result is a new documentary called 3212 Unredacted, and the investigative reporter behind the project spoke to Defense News Weekly.
James, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You have a new documentary out on Hulu called 3212 Unredacted. There's a lot of information about the 2017 attack in Niger. They killed 4 American service members. Tell us a little bit about your documentary.
Thank you. Well, this is a film produced for ABC News that is now streaming on Hulu, which I produced with my great colleagues, Brian Epstein and Andy Fredericks as co-producers. And it's based on, it's a story about the ambush of Operational Detachment Alpha 3212, which was a Green Beret team operating in Niger, West Africa in 2017 on a train, advise, assist mission. And they got into an ambush. They were ambushed by an ISIS force that was actually 10 times their number, and it resulted in 4 U.S. service members, 4 special operations soldiers who were killed in action. And it was an incident that at the time that seemed to really shock Washington in particular. It shocked the military, it shocked the Pentagon, it shocked the Trump White House, and it shocked Congress for some reason that a lot of folks didn't seem to realize we were operating combat missions in Niger.
So James, even if someone's been following the news since 2017 and they see the film, they're going to see new footage and new information. What is some of that new information that somebody's going to see?
So we looked at the report done by AFRICOM about this incident in which several accusations were made. And we drilled down. I did an investigation for 3.5 years to try to ascertain what had happened. And what I found was that this team did not go rogue on an unapproved mission by their senior commanders, as was alleged. They were not trying to kill an ISIS commander. They were actually trying to find him and track him, and they were actually not incompetent. In fact, they fought with extraordinary valor. The 4 men who died had never been in combat before, but they fought to the last round with bullets ripping through their flesh and bone. They fought to the death till their last breath. And then finally, the suggestion made by AFRICOM that they were somehow looking for intelligence on an American kidnapped a year earlier in 2016 was absolutely false. They were not looking for any intelligence about that American.
So a lot of the pain came from the actual incident. Mm-hmm. A lot of it was how the information was disseminated.
I mean, it's really unusual since 9/11 and the 20 years of warfare in many war zones to have a U.S. service member reported missing in action. And that's what happened on October 4th, 2017. Sergeant Lee David Johnson was reported missing in action after the gunfight in Tongo Tongo. And so a day after his family was notified of that, they got a phone call from an Army officer who told them that Lee David had actually been captured by the enemy. And then another 24 hours passed and the second knock at the door came, and Maisha Johnson, his widow, was informed that his body had been found. But it was really never explained why that phone call came about.
Did anybody ever find out who called her?
Never ascertained who called her, but they first told me about that in 2018, and a little over a year later, I found in the AFRICOM 268-page redacted report mention of this uncorroborated, unconfirmed intelligence report that was proven false, and I eventually got a hold of people who had been directly involved in the search for LaDavid and knew all the details about that report, and were shocked that his family would have been told about it.
And I watched the movie last night. It was a lot of stories of the families of the soldiers themselves. We didn't hear a lot from the command. Why was that?
Well, the command, this is quite interesting. Reprimands were laid onto all the low-level guys, the company commander on down, the detachment commander, the team sergeant, the intel warrant, and other low-level people involved in the mission. But the senior commanders of the battalion and third group level, Lieutenant Colonel David Painter and Colonel Brad Moses, were not punished in a way that ended their careers. In fact, the Senate actually blocked their promotions, not the Army, which promoted them. And this was a big question, why? Why were they not held accountable when they made the decisions about the mission? And they essentially disappeared. They essentially ghosted their own subordinates who were reprimanded. They ghosted the press. They ghosted the families. And Colonel Brad Moses, I interviewed by phone a year ago, and he was the 3rd Special Forces Group commander. He was the only person who didn't receive any sort of a reprimand, and he said that decision to not speak to anyone had been a poor decision, and it had not really been very thought out or wise.
There was a lot of anger towards the command because of the way the information was disseminated. There was maybe no accountability from the government, but it seems like something that the family's not going to forget. And
I think that the families all feel that the Pentagon, the current Pentagon under Secretary Lloyd Austin, and I think other folks in Congress feel this way as well, and veterans groups, should review the investigation and correct the record, that our film may provide the reason and roadmap for that, and also the Valor Awards that were downgraded. Several of the Valor Awards were downgraded, including a recommended Medal of Honor for Staff Sergeant Dustin Wright of Lyons, Georgia, and also Sergeant First Class Jeremiah Johnson. There's new video. The French recently recovered the actual full 45-minute helmet cam, portions of which ISIS had released itself as part of a propaganda video back in 2018. The French recovered the full video, and the families have all watched it now and have seen the extraordinary valor, even more than anyone was aware of these men who lost their lives. They really did fight to the death and never quit.
Is the current Pentagon, they must have eyes on this right now?
The current Pentagon issued a statement saying that they had promised a thorough and fair investigation that was also accurate, and did not really do much to defend the investigation done during the Trump administration, and certainly did not promise any sort of a new review, at least not yet.
Can you tell our viewers where they can watch it themselves?
It's on Hulu, streaming on Hulu since Veterans Day, and that's the best and only place that they can watch it, and I hope that people will. And obviously, for combat veterans and Gold Star families, they need to understand that it's a tough film to watch. I've gotten a lot of feedback from veterans who had to pause the film on a number of occasions because of their own emotions, but they finish it and they feel that we were tough but fair and honored the fallen, and of course also honored those families, which was something we really made profound efforts to do. And I'm very close to most of the family members today, and they're remarkable people, and they deserve better than what they got, as did their fallen loved ones.
I watched the movie last night. I really enjoyed it. I used the pause button myself quite a bit. Having that GoPro footage is really unlike anything I've seen before.
Yeah.
James, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate you guys taking a look at this, and thank you so much for watching our documentary.
Oh, you bet.
When we come back, some of the big contracting news coming out of the Dubai Air Show. And we head inside the Army's new Armor Museum. Stay right there.
Clear, but the U.S. State Department gave the green light to Tunisia in 2019 to enter talks with Textron. The U.S. Air Force is already a customer, and work on that aircraft will take place on the company's facility in Wichita, Kansas. Russia showed off its concept fighter that could compete with the F-35. Rostec showed off its Su-75 Checkmate fighter jet at the Dubai Air Show. Company official Viktor Kladov said that the state-owned Russian company held talks at the show with the Emirati companies that include the Tawazun Economic Council, Mubadala Investment Company, and Edge Group. They spoke about the production of the composite materials and telecommunications equipment. Kladov said it started its own program after an assessment showed a demand in the Middle East for a fifth-generation fighter. Some there compared it to the American Lockheed Martin F-35, and that comparison was welcomed by the head of Rostec's subsidiary, United Aircraft Corporation.
Спасибо большое за сравнение с проектом F-35. Это действительно серьезный проект, который является, так сказать, топом и концентрацией всех усилий американской аэрокосмической промышленности не только по созданию продуктов.
The version on the show floor is an experimental model, and the company expects to start production by 2026. Kladov also said Rostec has plans for an unmanned version of the plane. If you want to read more of Agnes Alhilu's coverage from the Dubai Air Show, visit defensenews.com. That's it for your Defense News contracting headlines. Up next, reporter Todd South hits inside a new armor and cavalry museum in Fort Benning in this week's edition of Miltech.
So normally on Miltech, we talk a lot about current and future technology, soldiers, gear, and equipment and vehicles that they're going to use. But we had a chance to visit a place that has some old technology, a museum, that's still relevant to soldiers and being taught to them today. That's the U.S. Army Armor and Cavalry Collection. It's a collection of about 140 pieces of armor, related armor assets such as artillery, companion vehicles, and actual tanks. That's all housed at Fort Benning, Georgia now. Pieces of it used to be at Fort Knox, Kentucky until they moved armor training down to Fort Benning. It's an assorted collection. Of course, there's a lot of things from the U.S. military collection going back all the way to World War I, kind of thinly armored cars that basically scouted around the trenches in the battlefield. But also, brand new items, things that were just in service a few years ago in theater. And it's not just U.S. pieces. I mean, we actually have captured enemy vehicles from Nazis in World War II and Japanese military pieces to Iraqi pieces from the first Gulf War in the early 1990s. And while this is an Army collection and predominantly has Army pieces, both our own Army and of course enemy Army, there's also a piece in there that was once part of the Army collection, was kind of rejected by service members at the time, but adopted by the Marine Corps. It's called the Ontos. It has multiple weapons systems on it. It was used heavily in Way City during Vietnam for urban fighting. In fact, many Marines after that battle say it pretty much saved the day. And it has a pretty interesting little 50 caliber targeting piece on it where it will shoot a single 50 caliber round that causes a flash that then the gunner at the time could use to time his rounds from his main guns. It was a pretty interesting little piece of armor, again, rejected by the Army because it didn't really work against European forces, but taken on by the Marine Corps. This is more than just a bunch of tanks sitting around for people to take pictures of. Soldiers actually use these to study old ways of using armor, old type of equipment, from communications to kind of rake-like devices on the front of the vehicles to sweep for mines, to the different types of small and medium caliber and large caliber type of cannons used to fire different types of munitions. Really, these are for students of armor to come view these, get around on them, see these in person in the flesh and not just in a book, and understand armor better. And while tanks definitely steal the show, there are some pretty cool little funky pieces that you can find within and wedged in between some of those tanks, from motorcycles to different types of 1 and 2 soldier type transports, everything from fully tracked vehicles to half track, tracks and wheels, to no tracks, basically wheeled vehicles with some semblance of armor to be used on the battlefield.
Thank you, Todd. When we come back, Jeanette Mack from Navy Federal Credit Union gives tips on the concepts of zero budgeting and how to make it work for you.
Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. On this edition of Money Minute, Navy Federal Credit Union personal finance expert Jeanette Mack dives into the topic of zero budgeting and how to set it up for you and your family.
If you're one of the many who've struggled with your finances and sticking to a budget, particularly during holiday shopping, zero-based budgeting may be the answer for you. In the same way businesses use it to account for every dollar every month, so can you. With a zero-based budget, your expenses have to match your income monthly. Every dollar you have is assigned to a task, so in the end, your income minus all your expenses equals zero. It's more than just budgeting and debt control. It's also a great way to help build your savings as well. Start by listing your monthly income. Fortunately for service members, that's pretty consistent. Next, track and categorize your monthly expenses. Create spending buckets like living expenses, debt, savings, and don't forget to account for things like registration renewals or gifts, even entertainment for the month. From there, you should include financial goals like saving for a dream car or vacation. Then rank them by importance and decide how much money you'll allow for each category, making sure you assign every dollar of your income to one of the buckets until you reach zero. In the beginning, you may forget an expense here or there, so expect to adjust as you go. Stay focused on covering the essentials, and you too can achieve your financial goals.
Thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next time. To get more of our coverage, be sure to check out our headlines online at Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps Times.com and DefenseNews.com. And to be the most up-to-date in your unit, get a list of our top stories in your email each weekday with our Early Bird Brief. And make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And when we come back, our top editors join us for this week's Reporters Roundtable with some of the biggest military headlines. Welcome back. As always, it's been a full week of complicated stories in the military realm, but our team of reporters and editors is on hand to break down some of the headlines in this week's Reporters Roundtable.
Welcome to the Military Times Reporters Roundtable, where we bring you the inside stories behind the biggest headlines each week. I'm Leo Shane, Capitol Hill Bureau Chief for Military Times. With me again this week are Megan Myers, our Pentagon Bureau Chief, and Howard Altman, our Managing Editor. Thank you both for your time today. Let's start with this report out of Oklahoma that the new commander of the state's National Guard has said he's not going to enforce the Defense Department's COVID-19 vaccine mandate on his troops. Howard, talk to me about this. What is the reasoning here?
Well, on November 2nd, the governor of Oklahoma, Kevin Stitt, wrote to the Pentagon asking them not to enforce the mandate on his Air and Army National Guard troops. He called the mandate irresponsible and said that only 10% of the troops had not taken the vaccine. Army Brigadier General Thomas Mancino, the acting adjutant general, said that he would not enforce the mandate on his troops while they're on state orders. The apparent rejection of the Pentagon's call to have troops vaccinated or face discipline and ultimately removal from the force.
So this is just for state orders. Megan, talk to me. What's the Pentagon's reaction to this? Oh, can the Oklahoma Guard, can they do this?
Yes, they are able to do this, but like Howard said, it would be limited to state orders. And so the thing that needs to be cleared up is what is considered a state status versus what is considered, a federalized status. The immediate reaction is, okay, you can't be mobilized on Title X orders. If you need to go to some sort of training or school to help with your career or for the readiness of the unit for a future national deployment or a national mobilization, you can't go to that if you're not vaccinated. The real question here will be, when you go to a drill weekend in the Guard and you are considered in a Title 32 status, does that mean you belong to the state or does that mean that you belong to the federal government? The federal government pays for that drilling weekend. So, the initial legal response is, well, if you're not vaccinated, you can't even do the most basic things in the Guard. So maybe this is all just for show. But the Pentagon has confirmed they are consulting with their lawyers, they're consulting with the National Guard Bureau to see what the proper response will be to this.
It seems like it's just a confusing mess here. Talk about the larger DoD mandate here and how things are going with vaccinating troops. Are we seeing most troops just going along with this?
At this point, it is most troops, and it's kind of broken down by service, honestly, based on the proximity that they are to their mandate deadline. So the Air Force made it to about 97% when its active duty deadline came up on November 2nd. The Navy is about 95% fully vaccinated, 99% partially vaccinated. Their mandatory deadline, along with the Marine Corps, comes up November 28th. And then it will be the Army after that, and then the reserve components after that. So it remains to be seen, especially for the Army and the Army National Guard, which does not have to be vaccinated until the end of June, how many people will be kind of stragglers after the end of this. But so far, the vast majority of troops are stepping up for these deadlines.
Well, while the Pentagon's dealing with that, they're also dealing with the fallout from two different Inspector General reports that pointed out failures in the handling of suicide screening among troops who are leaving the service and sexual assault cases among troops who are in the service. Megan, you covered both of these reports. Talk to us about what the problems they saw are.
The common denominator in both of these reports is that there are instructions and guidance governing how these two processes are supposed to be handled, and essentially it's just not being carried out. Not necessarily because somebody doesn't want to, but because the instructions, this happens often with DoD instructions, that if they are not meticulously clear about the implementation and the oversight for things, then the implementation and the oversight might not get done because someone will look at the memo and say, I don't know what this means. I don't think we have to do it. So, what that means for service members who've been getting out of the military, they're supposed to be getting a suicide risk screening as part of their separation battery of tests and screenings, and that's not happening consistently. And they're also not consistently being looked into VA services for the minute that they are discharged, so that if anything is going on with them right after they get their discharge papers, they can immediately plug into the VA for care. The issue with sexual assault is that there are supposed to be trained investigators and trained prosecutors specifically to handle sexual assault investigations assigned to every one of these cases that goes forward. That hasn't been happening. The services have largely said it's because we don't have enough of these people, and they have all agreed that they will do a better job trying to train more of these people, certify more of these people, so that they are available when they're called on to be assigned to these cases.
Look, I get that. I get that these can have complicated side issues and implementation things. But Howard, these are two issues that the military and Veterans Affairs have been dealing with for years now. To hear that they're just not getting some of these fundamental things done is mind-boggling. What kind of confidence can troops have if that their leadership is taking this seriously if they're seeing these kind of reports?
Well, people I've talked to and the reaction I've seen online, not much. People are not surprised that these things haven't happened the way they should. It's kind of the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. They're not at all surprised, and they don't believe anything will ever really change. Do you think anything will happen in Congress to move things along?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of frustration when these reports came out. We saw quite a few offices that were putting out angry statements saying, why can't they get this right? The suicide issue has been a major one on the veterans beat as well, and trying to get their arms around that, trying to find ways to reduce veteran suicide. One of the clearest things they've said is having these warm handoffs, having these connections so that there's seamless care for troops as they go into veterans' medical issues. But if that's not happening, if they're not getting those checks, if Veterans Affairs doctors don't know about problems, it's not going to solve it. So I don't know at this point. We'll see. I'm sure we'll see lots of angry statements, but if they've already mandated these changes, what more can they do? It's difficult. That's all we have time to cover here today, but thank you both for sharing your insights, and thank you all for tuning in. You can follow all of our coverage on these and other issues in coming weeks at militarytimes.com. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, team. We'll see you next time. Well, that's it for this week. Please visit us on militarytimes.com and defensenews.com for more coverage. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.